Take a look at this chart. It's not just a collection of lines and percentages, it's the story of a nation divided. Conducted by YouGov, this poll asked one pivotal question. In hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to leave the European Union? From 2017 to 2019, British public opinion danced on the edge, with nearly equal numbers leaning toward Brexit being the right move. But by the time the Brexit deal was finalised, the tide had shifted. The percentage of those believing it was the right move plummeted, while those who thought it was the wrong move soared. Fast forward to today, 55% now believe Brexit was the wrong decision, compared to just 34% who still think it was right. Now, the real question is, what do these results mean for Britain's future? The last significant shift in public opinion led to Brexit. Could this growing support for the EU spark discussions about re-entry? While a simple YouGov poll isn't enough to determine policy, this trend certainly raises the need for deeper reflection and perhaps broader public engagement. But why are we only talking about what Britain wants? What about what the EU wants? Is there a chance that the EU could reject the UK's proposal for re-entry? Let's begin by assuming that pro-EU wouldn't be the right choice of word for the former Prime Minister David Cameron, who did, in fact, have several qualms with the European Union. That being said, when half of Britain was advocating to leave the Union, he was amongst the other half that was advocating to stay, which again brings the question, why did he even call for a referendum in the first place? We might have to go a tad back. Over a decade to be precise, and recall Cameron's claims in 2013. He'd stated that should the Tories, his political party, win the next general election, there would be a referendum where the people of Great Britain would be given the final say on the UK's member state status. At that time, many believed that Cameron's announcement served two purposes. One, it all but guaranteed that the Tories would be elected come the next general election. While believing that EU membership was beneficial for the UK, Cameron was amongst a growing group in the United Kingdom that was becoming increasingly unhappy with the EU's rules and protocols. To be fair, the UK was joined by other member countries where Euroskepticism was on the rise. 2, he believed that the referendum would end the European Union debate. Let's pivot here, only slightly, and read through an excerpt from David Cameron's autobiography. My regrets about what had happened went deep. I knew then that they would never leave me, and they never have. Cameron was determined to end the Europe debate once and for all, particularly amongst his own party members. Had Britain voted to remain in the EU, it would have taken the nation another couple of years, if not decades, to hold another referendum. Simply, it wasn't a promise that every Prime Minister could make in their own terms. This made Cameron's term all the more memorable alongside his own conflict where he was urging the people of Great Britain to vote Remain. In his memoir, Cameron claims that there were a million things he did wrong, but the ballot was inevitable and the referendum had to be held. He just wished the outcome would have been different. On that note, Cameron did try to work out a deal with Brussels. On the EU's end, they wanted the UK to stay for several reasons. For one, the EU was well aware of the rising Eurosceptic wave that had taken over several member states, one of which was the United Kingdom. The referendum would spark a chain of events. Brexit would have followed by Frexit, Grexit, and so on. This would weaken the EU's credibility as an integrated union with Europe. Looking back in hindsight, Brexit did trigger a series of events, but not in the way the EU had anticipated. If anything, it curbed rising Euroscepticism elsewhere. But the EU didn't know that at the time. What it did know, however, was that the UK was a significant contributor to the EU economically and politically. It was one of the EU's largest economies, a vital trade partner, providing strong financial services sectors and made significant contributions to the EU's budget and causes. The UK also brought diplomatic and military strengths, contributing to the EU's global influence, particularly in security and defence cooperation. The EU attempted to prevent Brexit through a series of measures aimed at addressing the UK's concerns. Before the 2016 referendum, the EU negotiated a special status for the UK, offering concessions such as limiting access to certain social benefits for EU migrants and reaffirming that the UK would not be bound by an ever closer union. That special status was what Cameron had been hoping for. Between 2015 and 2016, Cameron held a series of talks with EU leaders wherein he brought up concerns and demanded that the EU provide the UK with a solution that could counter rising Euroscepticism. Brussels complied, but only as much as they could or wanted to. To give you the rundown of what Cameron wanted versus what he procured, immigration was a massive failure, but political integration wasn't. With regards to immigration, Cameron had proposed certain breaks that would restrict the massive inflow of migrants from EU member states and their claims to UK welfare. He proposed that all EU member state migrants would be exempt from council or welfare benefits for a period of up to 4 years. He also claimed that the job-seeking EU member state migrants would have 6 months to find a job or else they'd have to go back. Lastly, Cameron wanted the EU to restrict EU member state migrants from sending payments to their children back home. The EU didn't budge much, if at all. His propositions faced intense backlash from members within Eastern Europe who had huge migrant communities living in the United Kingdom. This meant that existing migrants would not be exempted from receiving welfare benefits. He got the 4-year emergency break on in-work benefits he'd set up such a store by, but new arrivals will have their tax credits phased in over 4 years. The break will be in place for a maximum of 7 years rather than the 13 years that Cameron had wanted. Elsewhere, Cameron secured victories. For example, if 55% of national parliaments agree, they could effectively block or veto a Commission proposal. This meant that the EU's mass integration plan wouldn't include the UK, should the UK call for a vote on the matter. But why was a look back into the past necessary? Because we had to establish before talking about what the UK and the EU want now, how even the Prime Minister tried to stop Brexit from happening. Yet he could only do so much, or frankly restricted himself to only doing so much, and that the ultimate decision lied in the hands of the millions of people who came out in 2016 to vote, a majority of whom voted to leave the Union. Cameron resigned the next day. The 2016 referendum was far from being the end of the Europe debate, as Cameron put it. If anything, the Europe debate has only intensified in the years since Brexit occurred. But the discourse has changed. According to a 2024 poll, 49% of Britishers wished to rejoin the EU, whereas 35% were content with the decision to leave. The remaining few didn't know if Brexit was beneficial or not for Britain. But we're not talking about the UK wanting re-entry here, at least not solely. UK's membership cannot be discussed without first assessing the EU's standing in the matter, as in, would the Union ever want the United Kingdom back? A few things are worth considering here, all of which have to do with membership in the EU. Firstly, membership to the EU is referred to as EU accession, to ensure that prospective member countries meet specific political, economic and legal standards set forth by the Union. A prospective member applies for EU membership by submitting an application to the European Council. To be eligible, the prospective member has to meet a certain set of rules and regulations, stated as the EU's fundamental values. Broadly, these are democracy, the rules of law, human rights, and a functioning market economy. The first step in the accession process begins after the application has been submitted and reviewed by the European Council. If the fundamental values are met, the Council agrees to grant the prospective member candidate status. This is not the same as becoming a member state. This kickstarts a process wherein the Council determines if every other parameter set forth by the Union is met. Furthermore, the Council has to hold negotiations with prospective members, what's required of them, what they get in return, and a set of rules they must abide by. Not every country agrees. Iceland didn't. The country formally applied for EU membership in July 2009, driven by political shifts after the 2008 financial crisis. The crisis heavily impacted Iceland's economy, and EU membership was seen as a way to stabilize the economy and adapt to the euro. Iceland was granted candidate status in June 2010, and accession negotiations began soon after. After the 2013 parliamentary elections, the new government, led by the centre-right Independence Party and Progressive Party, suspended accession talks, reflecting strong public opinion to EU membership. Today, Iceland remains outside the EU but is part of the European Economic Area and Schengen area, which allows it access to the EU single market and free movement of people. Anyway, circling back to when a country applies for membership, the Council reviews the country's status and compares it with the Copenhagen criteria for membership. The Council will monitor a country's progress. This is primary reason why countries are never given membership status immediately after applying. For example, Croatia joined in 2013 after a 10-year process, and Turkey has been a candidate since 1999. The United Kingdom's government is well versed in the membership process, as well as any and all potential roadblocks that might come along the way. To say that the UK, if it were to apply for membership for the first time ever, would be granted immediate entry into the EU wouldn't be an understatement. What would be an overstatement, as the UK currently stands as a former member, would be that the EU would readily accept the nation back and grant it full member status. To clarify, Keir Starmer's government has ruled out the possibility of rejoining the EU, clarifying that the Labour Party isn't primarily concerned with the prospect of a single market or customs union membership, at least for now. Could this have been a preventative move, softening the blow from the EU when they rejected the UK's re-entry application? A few things to consider here are that all member states must accept the candidate's application. Because, by way of Brexit, other members have been given greater representation in the European Parliament and greater influence in decision-making in the European Council. That's not all. Remember how we said that the EU was worried that Brexit would inspire a Frexit, Grexit, and so on? Well, it ended up doing the opposite. Seeing the economic impact of Brexit and how it impacted the nation's relationship with the largest union in Europe, Euroscepticism dwindled down, to the point that France's Marine Le Pen, who once famously called herself Madame Frexit, dropped France's withdrawal from the EU as a talking point from her presidential campaign. A poll conducted by Redfield and Wilton for the UK in a changing Europe shows that just 27% of voters think it is likely that EU member states would accept the UK's application to rejoin the Union. This stat showcases that no matter what the UK's population wants, they're pessimistic about the UK's future in the EU simply because of the mess that Brexit created. That being said, never say never. The EU isn't averse to the idea of allowing the UK to join. There is some support for the prospect. The European Free Alliance, a European parliamentary group of regionalist political parties, had stated that the EU must also be sure to never close the door on the peoples of the UK. Defense, spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is a key focus, with groups like the EPP prioritizing this. Others, such as the European Free Alliance, ALDE, and the Party of European Socialists, also advocate stronger UK-EU relations. If the UK ever seeks EU membership again, its previous opt-outs from policies like the Euro and Schengen would likely not be available. It's been called a second referendum, and this wouldn't be the first time British audience has heard that phrase. Did you know that in the weeks following the original referendum, an online petition was launched that demanded a rerun if a supermajority was not reached, amassing 4.15 million signatures? This warranted its day in Westminster Hall, where MPs debated the petition but ultimately rejected the proposal. Likewise, Labour had been steadfast in its position. Starmer's government will not hold a second referendum. It doesn't matter what the polls are suggesting. But why? In 2018, David Lammy, a prominent Labour Member of Parliament and People's Vote booster, called on his colleagues to stop this madness through a vote in Parliament. In the same year as Theresa May's talks with Brussels were leading nowhere except a potential no-deal withdrawal, 700,000 people marched in London calling themselves proponents of the People's Vote. That was the seemingly third group that spun in the aftermath of the referendum. But was it really a third group, or was it just mobilized faction of the Remain group that still had some spunk left in them? Experts claimed that calling for a second vote and labeling it the People's Vote was unfair and misleading, considering how the first vote was also the People's Vote, in which they declared they wanted Brexit to go through. The argument raised was that allowing a second referendum to take place immediately after the results of the first were read would lead to a state of anarchy. Will there be votes and revotes until people get what they want? The political face of Britain, as we once knew, changed. In February 2019, pro-EU MPs split from Labour and the Conservatives to form the Independence Group, all backing a referendum. Labour adopted a policy supporting a public vote on any withdrawal deal by September 2019. Take a look at the results from the YouGov poll. It reveals that a significant majority of the British public would vote to rejoin the European Union if a hypothetical referendum with 59% in favour and 41% opposed. Conducted over 8 years after the Brexit vote, the survey also shows strong support for closer ties between the UK and the EU, though voters do not believe the elected Labour government has a mandate to pursue the full EU membership. However, there is considerable public backing for strengthening relations with the EU without rejoining. One thing is clear: the United Kingdom's decide to withdraw from the EU, thinking it was the best move for them, only to change its mind later on. It's clear that a vast majority now wants back into the Union, but it's also clear that holding another referendum simply to undo the first one would set a bad precedent. Likewise, taking the UK back with no recourse would set a bad precedent for the Union. So what's next in the UK and EU's relationship?